Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to the third annual Gerry Philipsen Forum sponsored by the University of Washington Debate Union. So tonight, we're all going to be educated by our lovely debaters here about a very important issue becoming more and more prevalent within Washington State, which is Initiative 732, the Carbon Tax Initiative. I'm Rohan Hyatt, first-year student and member of the Debate Union here at the University of Washington, and tonight I'll be serving as your moderator for this debate. The Debate Union is a program within the Department of Communication that seeks to promote civic dialogue in the community as well as on campus, and sponsors our intercollegiate policy debate team. Our program is open to all undergraduate students at UW, and although our program is very new, only 2 years young, we've quickly grown to become the largest policy debate program in the Pacific Northwest. And in 2015, we were named the National New Program of the Year by the Cross-Examination Debate Association. Our special event tonight is the annual Philipsen Debate Forum. The Philipsen Forum was established in 2013 to honor Gerry Philipsen, a former professor in the Department of Communication. A past debater himself, Dr. Philipsen was a strong supporter of undergraduate debate, believing that debate wasn't just for experts on the debate team, but was an easily accessible and effective tool for all undergraduate students. The Philipsen Forum is meant to recognize this belief. Today's debate doesn't feature debate union members like myself with years and years of debate experience. Instead, it features our fellow undergraduates competing in their very first debate. Now, they've worked really hard, and you'll be very impressed at what they'll show you, but this is, remember, their very first live debate. But frankly, I think you'll quickly agree that Dr. Philipsen was right. Excellent debate is within the reach of every student. Our competitors will be discussing the topic of Initiative 732 within Washington. This ballot initiative would impose a tax on carbon emissions within the state. The affirmative side will be in support of the passage of this initiative, while the negative side will be in opposition to its passing. Throughout the debate, multiple aspects of the proposal will be discussed, including its economics, its feasibility, and its environmental impact. We're also lucky enough to feature an expert respondent tonight. Mr. Scott Montgomery is a geologist and adjunct professor in the Jackson School of International Studies here at UW, and has written multiple books on issues pertaining to resources and the intersection of science and culture. Toward the end of the debate, I will ask Mr. Montgomery to join us to respond to and discuss the topic of the debate with the audience. And now, And now for the moment you've all been waiting for, I'd like to introduce our competitors. So on the affirmative side, we have our first speaker majoring in bioengineering, Ashley Young. Our second speaker on the affirmative side is Sammy Costa, majoring in Law, Societies, and Justice. And our third speaker on the affirmative side is Leo Yang, majoring in Business. And now on the negative side, we have Mason Berger, who is majoring in Biochemistry. We have Angela Park, who is intended Biochemistry. And we have Avery Strand, who is a Communications and Creative Writing major. The format of the debate tonight will be as follows. Each competitor will be giving one speech on their side of the topic. The first 4 speeches, the constructives, are 5 minutes long each. The opposing team, for whatever side is speaking at the time, will have the chance to ask questions during these constructive speeches. They will signal these questions by standing up, and 1 minute into each constructive speech, I'm going to bang this gavel or stapler onto the table, and that's going to notify them that they can start asking questions. During the last 2 speeches, which are 4 minutes long each, there will be no questioning allowed. After each speech, I'm going to announce who is speaking next, and then they'll begin their speech. So before we begin, just a couple of quick reminders. First off, immediately after the debate, Mr. Montgomery will be invited to join us. Afterwards, the event will then be closed by our director, Dr. Michael Souders. Second, I would like to extend a thank you to the supporters of the UW Debate Union. Here at the UW, the union would not be possible without the support of the Department of Communication. And I would also like to thank our private sponsors, including Propel Insurance and Mr. Ken Meyer. Finally, if you are a person in a class who is getting extra credit, there will be a table in the rotunda outside following the event where you can get your form signed. So, everyone ready? Let's begin. Giving the first affirmative constructive speech will be Ashley on the affirmative side.
Climate change continues to affect the environment and its people every day. NASA reports that climate change has caused ocean levels to rise due to melting ice sheets, ocean acidity to increase due to CO2 emissions, and global and ocean temperatures to rise because of the trapping of greenhouse gases. Not only does it affect our environment, but it also affects our health as well. The World Health Organization predicts that between the years 2030 and 2050, that over 250,000 deaths will occur. In addition, it will cost us about $2 to $4 billion. An example of the implications for climate change is safe drinking water. Safe drinking water is already very difficult to find in underdeveloped countries, but as climate change worsens, it will only get harder. The World Health Organization cites that having unsafe drinking water causes 750,000 deaths each year. And this can only get worse as malnutrition and foodborne illnesses occur, which can in turn cause 3.1 million deaths. I understand that even thinking about fighting against climate change seems like an insurmountable obstacle and seems like an impossible task, especially because places like China and India practice such environmentally unfriendly practices. Yes?
Early in your debate, you said there were 250,000 deaths that would be caused by this. Where exactly would those be occurring?
These 250,000 deaths will occur and affect everyone. Approximately 38,000 elderly people will be affected by this when they are exposed to excessive heat. 95,000 children will die due to undernutrition, and 60,000 people will die due to malaria. Continuing on, places like China and India, they practice such environmentally unfriendly practices in their factories and businesses, and they don't want to change their policies, and they don't want to benefit the environment positively because they don't want to lose their competitive edge over the US. However, we must be the ones who start this change. If we set an example for other states to follow, then everyone will see that this is a problem. We must set precedents. Though it's not a lasting solution, it's a start. If we think too much about creating a lasting solution, nothing will ever change. No bill will ever be passed, and nothing will ever happen. And the world and its people will continue to suffer. Furthermore, corporations must be held accountable for their ways. By making businesses reliable, greener energy is created and the necessary positive change occurs. Businesses will either have to implement greener policies or pay taxes. And in turn, it can cause other people and other corporations to do that, whether they create greener energy, use greener energy, or change the way they create their products. This bill, I-732, implements a $25 per metric ton tax over a 2-year period, with an increase by 3.5% as the years go on, until it reaches a maximum of $100 per metric ton. This bill decreases sales tax by 1%, eliminates B&O business taxes for manufacturers, and funds the working families rebate so that over 400,000 low-income families can be granted $1,500 a year. This bill aims to decrease CO2 emissions, shift bad taxes away from businesses and families, and compensate $20 billion to the budget gap for the upcoming years. This bill is not aimed to decrease the carbon footprint of Washington State. It's not going to reverse all the damage that's already been done. However, it will push us in the right step forward. I previously stated that places like China and India refuse to implement climate policies that affect the environment positively because they don't want to lose their competitive edge over the US. However, this bill will change that because by Washington State starting this, it will set off a chain reaction. Other states will realize, oh, this is a problem. And though they might not necessarily implement I-732 in their states, they will tailor this bill into fitting their own needs. And if states continue to do this, then the country as a whole becomes greener. And if this country becomes whole as a greener, then other countries will see, oh, the US isn't a first world power that's focusing just on being a first world power. They care about their global impact and how they affect others. It's not about changing the world anymore or changing climate. Or saving the future for coming generations. It's about setting precedents. We must be the example for the rest of the world to follow. By being the first, it shows the rest of the world that this is a problem that must be changed. By being the first domino in the chain reaction, everything will fall. We must take the first steps in changing something that we've caused. It's not perfect, but it's what's on the table. If we're deceived into thinking that this bill will stop climate change and it will reverse all the damage that's been done, then destruction is inevitable. As Voltaire once said, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good."
All right, I I'd now like to recognize Mason, who will be giving the first negative constructive speech.
All right, I'd like to start by thanking everyone for showing up tonight. This is a very important issue to many Washingtonians because we all believe that climate change is a problem that is real. Because it has the potential to be the last problem that we ever have. And as previously stated, there's many problems that we're facing, like rising sea levels, more severe weather around the globe, and the rise in ocean acidification. So it's important as we go forward that we need to implement policies that harvest real solutions to this problem. Fact of the matter is, I-732 doesn't solve any of these problems. It may give people an incentive to lower their carbon emissions, but in the end, there's no new revenue that's going to be used for environmental projects. When we have tax revenue collected, those things go towards, when we pay taxes on things like gasoline, that's something that the revenue generated from those taxes is going to go towards funding new bridges, paving roads, and other infrastructure projects. And there's other systems that are out there that we could implement that would actually raise funds, like a cap and trade system. California has already implemented this kind of a system, and it's been able to allow companies to buy and sell carbon credits, balancing an economy for carbon, and it also raises money that can be used for green technology. Yes, sir.
So the carbon trade system do sound like a pretty good deal, but when exactly is it going to be enforced? Or let's step back, when exactly is going to be put it on the decision table?
Right. So this is a good question. Obviously, right now, it's not on the proposition today. We're not going to be able to vote on it, but it could be something that we could get in the future, and we shouldn't just stop at what we have here today, but get something that's better that's actually going to work and solve our problems. So the affirmative today is going to make the argument that this proposition is going to set precedent for the rest of the nation and potentially the world when trying to get other people to adopt this idea of a carbon tax. But this simply isn't going to set a precedent. Washington State isn't like the rest of the country. The Washington Post reports that there are 511 carbon factories that generate electricity that account for 34% of the nation's electricity right now. In Washington State, there's only one coal factory that creates electricity, and it's going to get shut down in the year 2025. So if we look at a broader fossil fuels and how much electricity that they generate 64% of the nation's electricity. In the state of Washington, carbon fuels only account for 8% of our electricity. That's not going to set a precedent. So states that would set a precedent would be ones like West Virginia. West Virginia has coal power plants that account for 95% of their electricity. That's a huge difference. If they implemented a carbon tax, they would be the ones truly implementing a system that set a precedent because people could look at them and see what they're doing to lower carbon emissions and simultaneously being able to fuel their power grid. Now, another thing that's a huge problem with this proposition is the deficit it's going to cause for our state's tax system. The four major tax changes are the carbon tax, the elimination of the manufacturer B&O taxes, the 1% sales tax reduction, and an income, a credit provided to low-income families. And so when they advertise this as a tax-neutral solution, you would think that every fiscal year there's going to be zero change to the amount of money that our state's going to be receiving. But this isn't the case. If you go to the Carbon Washington website, this is the group that's behind this proposition, and I encourage everyone here tonight to actually go home and do this. Research their estimations for our state's revenue system. And you'll see for 2018, for that individual year, there is a $321 million revenue increase. This is partly because the 1% sales tax decrease is only going to be 0.5% in the first year, and it'll be a full 1% by 2019. So if you go to 2019, then you'll see that there's actually a $50 million revenue decrease. 2020, a $100 million revenue decrease. And by 2021, for that individual year, there's a $120 million revenue decrease. And they say over these 4 years, that's a $44 million revenue increase. But as you can tell, as the years to come, it's going to keep going down and we're going to lose more money. And this is important to realize that right now our Congress isn't able to fund basic necessities like education. The federal government currently is fining our government for its inability to provide education and it's not able to propose a way to fund education. Thank you.
All right, I'd now like to recognize Sammy to give the second affirmative constructive speech.
Climate change impacts more than just us, more than just the people in this room or our own generation. It impacts all of us for years to come, and we can set the stage right now for how future generations, for how our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be interacting with the world around them. If we don't start to make serious changes right now, we can never expect for our Earth to ever get better. This is the way to start, with this law right in front of us in our very own state. Washington State can be a catalyst for global change. It can serve as the precedent our Earth so desperately needs in order to remain livable for ourselves and future generations to come. As you all well know, Seattle has recently adopted a $15 minimum wage for workers, something that is now being looked at in a nationwide context. Whether or not the entire nation actually adopts this is yet to be seen, it does show that a single city, right here in Washington State already, can set the agenda for the rest of the United States. Seattle barely reaches into the top 20 most populated cities in the US, and yet something that our city has adopted has the power to influence other cities, states, and even the presidential campaign, with Bernie Sanders also advocating for $15 minimum wage. Yes, question?
So earlier you mentioned that Seattle's already implemented a $15 per hour minimum wage.
Yes.
How's that going to set a precedent for other states and cities that have a much lower cost of living?
Yes, I can concede that Seattle does have a very high cost of living, and that is why we have moved to this $15 minimum wage. However, a state like Arkansas that has a much lower cost of living, I believe one of the lowest 5 costs of living in the entire United States, still is set at the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. In order to sustain a family of 4 in Arkansas above the poverty line, each parent needs to bring in $14 an area just to be above poverty line. So yes, I still believe the $15 an hour could be used across the United States. We can now take this precedent that we've clearly already established and move our power to other areas, such as now with climate change and carbon emissions. Now, the opposition expresses concerns this tax can never work. However, a similar tax was already enacted in British Columbia in 2008. Since its enactment in 2008, British Columbian carbon emissions have gone down a total of 16%. In addition to their decrease in carbon emissions, their overall economy of British Columbia has actually improved. From inception in 2008 until 2013, when a study was conducted by the Carbon Tax Center, it showed that GDP of British Columbia improved at a greater rate than all of Canada as a whole. BC gained an overall 0.9% increase economic boost in their economy due to this tax. If the US experiences a similar economic boost, that could account for $1 trillion added into our economy. Increase in carbon emission taxes leads to an increase in overall GDP. Now, while we have been focusing on the climate change aspect, we need to be focusing on another aspect as well, people. In 2007, a study was conducted in California by the RAND Corporation. They were seeking the same information that we are right now. What is the cost of having this pollution in our system? They found that between Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance, an estimated $188 million was being allocated to pollution-related healthcare needs over a 2-year time span in California alone. That's a lot of money. That's money that is already being spent right now combating an issue we can be doing more to prevent in the first place. All we did in California then, all we're doing in the world right now is placating a very real and serious issue. We're essentially slapping a Band-Aid on it, calling it good, but we need to be making more change and more progression right now. As you can see, I-732 will be far-reaching in its benefits, ranging everything from the economy to the healthcare. However, it also has the ability to help very specific demographics of people. Carbon emissions are most prominently released in metropolis areas, otherwise known as densely packed cities with low-income minority people. If carbon emissions are reduced, we'll most dramatically see these reductions in these cities with these demographics. People of color living in these impoverished areas have shown to breathe in 40% more pollution in their air than their white counterparts. That leads to more asthma, heart disease, and more. If we can cut back on our carbon emission, we can cut back on the unnecessary harm we're causing entire demographics of incredibly racialized groups. This tax has the rationale that if we're forced into increased spending where carbon emissions is concerned, that will drive conservation, innovation, and the development of new technologies. Again, we understand this isn't the ultimate solution, but it's the best starting point we can create right now while it's here. I do, however, want to leave you with a quote from environmental activist Wendell Berry in 1971. "The world is not given by his fathers, but borrowed from his children."
All right, I'd now like to recognize Angela to give the second negative constructive speech.
Initiative 732 doesn't do enough. We acknowledge, as the affirmative team said, that the main goal of this initiative is not to reduce carbon emissions overall very significantly, but it's rather to initiate a larger, more global movement towards reducing the negative effects of carbon emissions. But the opposite of what we're intending with this initiative may actually be achieved. If we do implement this tax, our government may feel that it's the end to our moral obligation to do something about carbon emissions. The false perception that because we've done something, that we've done enough, is a very dangerous mentality. Even if we do influence other states into following our lead, if their efforts are similarly minimal, then the sense of accomplishment that we've done something may stop any actual significant impact. Speaking of stopping significant impacts, if corporations are forced to pay carbon emission taxes, they may not choose the route of innovation or searching for cleaner, more, better sources of energy. They may actually choose to outsource and place their factories in other countries in order to obviously avoid strict environmental regulations. That means potentially fewer jobs in the US, but more importantly, it means no actual impact on the global environment is being made. Why? That's because the emissions are still going to be happening, just in other countries instead of ours. The affirmative team also argued that because British Columbia is similar to Washington, that their carbon tax, or a similar carbon tax to theirs, will work here in Washington as well. It's true, we acknowledge British Columbia is very similar to Washington State. So it's also true that a carbon tax here may have similar effects. But let's think about whether or not that means the goal of our proposition is accomplished. If our goal is to establish a precedent for other states to follow our lead, British Columbia is no longer an effective model to use for this argument. British Columbia and Washington derive the majority of their electricity from hydropower, but the United States as a whole only gets about 7% of their electricity from hydro, whereas coal generates almost no electricity in BC. Coal is the single largest source of power in half of our country. So why is this important? Why is it important that British Columbia is not an appropriate model for the rest of our states to use? If our goal is to establish a precedent for other states to follow our lead, follow our model, adopt a policy, adopt a carbon tax, but there's no evidence that it will work in their states, there is going to be no momentum. And the goal that this initiative is trying to achieve is not going to be accomplished. Lastly, I-732 is also disproportionately damaging to low-income families. Some even call it a poor people's tax. I-732... Yes, question.
Okay, so you say that this is a poor people's tax. However, statistics show that 31% of CO2 emissions are caused by high-income individuals and 9% by low-income individuals. So how can you say that this is still a poor people's tax?
Okay. So low-income households are not deriving the same benefits from this initiative. They are using so low-income families are using the same resources to pay for their basic necessities, like adequate food, clothing, housing. In contrast, high-income families are able to better enjoy the luxury of environmental benefits because they already have the required necessities to live. So if environmental protection is valuing high-income families more, then Initiative 732 as an environmental policy is going to be regressive. Going back to the poor people's tax, I-732 is cutting sales taxes. It's expanding a program called the Working Families Rebate, which is sending $1,500 a year in cash to 400,000 low-income families. That sounds good, but it's arguably not enough. There are a lot of families that still fall under this low-income range, but they're not hitting that cut line for the 400,000 families. What does that mean? It means that they're expected to pay the same price for carbon, but they're not receiving the compensation for it. So it's hitting the lower middle class harder in terms of financial disadvantage. And that last cut in sales tax by 1%, that's not going to be a huge amount of savings for the families that just aren't spending that much to begin with. A 2011 report done on consumer expenditure by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they show that there was a positive correlation between your income and the amount of money you're spending. That means that high-income individuals who are spending more money are also saving more money through this tax. That means I-732 is positively benefiting high-income individuals more. So the poor and the wealthy are paying the same price for carbon when they just don't have the same means to pay. So not only is I-732 ineffective, like we previously mentioned, but its effects are also going to be classist and unequal. Thank you.
All right, now on to the rebuttal speeches. So with the first affirmative rebuttal, we have Leo.
Ladies and gentlemen, global warming is happening with no doubt and question. At this point, we're no longer wondering if we're going to do something about it. The primary question now is how we're going to deal with it. The I-732 could be our brave first trial towards a more carbon-free society, a healthier economic structure, and a brighter future. It may not be the most well-rounded plan. It may fail to guarantee the profit of everyone in the society. However, it is the plan we currently have on our table. It is the plan we can enforce right now. It is the plan that seems most promising among all of its competitors. There is a possibility, though, that our government come up with a brilliant plan that can make everyone happy. Yet that plan may take forever to come up. They may seem fancy and cool, but they will only be a progressive unicorn, perfect yet unreachable. If we don't pass I-732, it doesn't only mean we stop trying, but it also means we do nothing about carbon emission for at least another 3 years. 3 years may seem short to us, but it actually means a lot to the environment as a whole. Because in 3 years, our sea level could rise 9 millimeters, pushing low-altitude coast areas one step closer to the cliff of being immersed. Because in 3 years, our global temperature can rise another 0.5 degree, making more glacial ice to melt down and making more polar bears to be homeless. We need to act right now. The negative side claimed that because Washington State and British Columbia's unique hydropower system, I-732 will fail to establish a precedent for other states to adopt carbon tax. However, the purpose of I-732 is never to motivate other states to adopt the exact same policy as we do. Here's the message we're trying to deliver. Now, it is time for our government to step forward and do something about carbon emission. And to fulfill this goal, carbon tax is not the only way. Local government should adopt whatever method that fits them the most. The important thing is, our government should step forward and do something. The negative side then claimed that carbon tax makes people less morally obligated to protect the environment. This is not the case, since carbon tax is only an outward expression of our growing environmental awareness. It will not be the moral end. Think about this. Have US citizens ever felt less morally obligated to protect their nation just because they are paying tax to the government? However, just the moral itself won't have enough power. That is why, again, we need to pass this initiative so that government can regulate carbon emission in a more quantified and organized way. It is also not a fact that if we increase our tax, companies will outsource. In fact, companies moving into areas with higher tax all the time to seek better opportunities. The Silicon Valley would be a great example of high-tax areas that still attract tons of companies. Finally, I-732 is not a band-aid bill. It's not only a band-aid bill. It's a stepping stone towards more scientific design policies. Take the carbon trade system mentioned by the oppositions, for example. One of the fundamental purposes of I-732 is to bring our carbon emission levels similar to Canada and California, so that we are able to join their carbon trade system when we're ready. In other words, carbon trade is impossible without I-732. It will be a hat in cloud without foot on ground. Ladies and gentlemen, the situation now is simple and clear. It is either this text or no move at all. And we need this text because carbon emission, because I-732 can be the stepping stone towards better bills. Because we need companies to be held accountable. Because we cannot let perfect be the enemy of the good. Thank you.
And finally, we have Avery with the first negative rebuttal.
If there's one thing we've learned from this debate, it's that Initiative 732 is complex, that it affects all of us individually. It hits our schools, it hits our businesses, it hits our taxes, and it'll make gas prices higher. And because it reaches so far into our society and has its fingers so deeply ingrained with us, it's our obligation as civilians to be cautious. We must be cautious because Washingtonians by nature are progressives. We like change, we embrace it. We're usually the first. But the fact of the matter is the idea of this change is clouding our judgment. In 2001, Congress passed the Patriot Act shortly after 9/11. We now realize that this stripped us of our individual privacies and freedoms. This was a knee-jerk reaction, and it wasn't okay. In 2009, shortly after realizing that global warming was a real and immediate danger, we pumped $500 million into Solyndra, an energy company in California. Just 2 years later, it was bankrupt. The money was lost. We've had knee-jerk reactions as a society, and we've rushed into big decisions, and we've made mistakes. Initiative 732 is just that. It helps corporations, and it hurts us. So it's bad, but we're not the only ones saying it. The Washington State Labor Council is comprised of 600 unions and has over 450,000 paying members. These are the people that are working in the very industry that is going to be taxed. These are our car builders, our laborers. They cite the $1 billion lost over the next 4 years as the reason they can't support it. They say it's too big of a bullet to swallow. These guys, they said that it's our moral obligation to pass this because communities of color and low-income areas don't have a voice and because global warming affects them the most. And while global warming may affect them the most, them not having a voice is simply not true. Front and Center is Seattle's leading community of color activist group. And they cite the same $1 billion bullet as the reason they can't support this bill. They say it's a Band-Aid, that it doesn't work. The proponents of this bill have managed to shift this debate from one of pragmatism to one of morality. They've skipped the feasibility aspect of the bill. It doesn't work. There's a reason it's so contentious. There's a reason we're debating it today. It's because it doesn't work. Republicans initially proposed this bill. They dropped it. Democrats picked it up. They dropped it. The only people supporting this bill are the ones who wrote it themselves, Carbon Washington. On top of it not working, there are better bills out there. Richard Corenshank is the head of the Cascadia Project here in Washington, which is a Democratic blog, and he has a real voice in the state. And he says that true progressives are the ones not supporting this bill, but the ones supporting a cap-and-trade system, one that works. And it's not like this is far off in the future. It's now. The Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy has a proposition on the table. It's here. California has passed a cap-and-trade system and has had tons of benefits. They've had weatherized homes, they've had rebates for cars that are energy efficient, and they've made light speed rails. This bill, Initiative 732's the biggest thing that it does is that it's neutral, or at least it claims so. But we know that the $1 billion it loses doesn't. The cap-and-trade system makes money. It'll bring money into the economy through a credit system in which we can trade carbon credits between companies. So they can burn carbon if they can't, if they need to, but if they don't need to, they can sell it to other companies. So it would bring money into the economy. 70% of it would go towards global warming research. 20% of it would go towards clean water research and distribution. 10% would go towards forest research. It boils down to this. We're not bad for not passing Initiative 732. It's not our fault that the bill doesn't work. We're making the correct social, fiscal, and environmental decision. Not only are there better bills out there already, this one isn't okay.
And with that, the debate comes to a conclusion. So let's give all of our competitors one last round of applause. I'd now like to invite Mr. Scott Montgomery up to the stage to discuss this resolution with the audience and the competitors. Let's give him a round of applause.
The winners. Okay, very interesting, very good presentations. Little more emotion now and then. I think I would say that Avery had some good qualities about the emotion, and that Sammy had a bit too. Speak up a little bit more. Emotion in a debate is a very, very powerful force. And I'm not going to sit here and teach you about debate, because there is a class that some of you are taking, and you don't need that kind of redundancy. What I'd like to do just for a moment, rather than to congratulate the debaters ad vomitum, is to give you a global perspective on what they're talking about. This is very important, because obviously this is not just a tempest in a teapot. It's not just something that involves Washington or the West Coast or blue states or the United States. It really is something that is pressing in the world. I was surprised, I guess, that in December the world came together for the first time over global warming. We prefer climate change in the science community because not all of the world is going to warm. There are actually some areas that may cool. And climate change is probably a more precise term to use. And another thing about it, it's a term that is more specific and a little bit more threatening. The idea that the globe is warming, okay, but the climate is changing, and it's changing very rapidly, and now we are seeing the events that come from that. Anyway, let's get back to the global perspective, which is quite something. And this is what I teach about and write about quite a bit. So China was brought up. China's a very, very important country when it comes to energy, and that's because China is the largest energy consumer in the world. It surpassed the US in 2007. The next year it surpassed the US in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And last year it surpassed the US as the world's largest oil importer. Now, China is doing something about its pollution and its carbon emissions. They go together. It has to, because if it doesn't, it's going to risk social unrest at a very high level. So a number of quotes were given as to the numbers of people who die every year due to climate change in the future, 2030 to 2050, you mentioned. The estimates right now are between 500,000 and 1.8 million Chinese die every year because of coal pollution. Every year. So when you think about that and you compare it to things that we are worried about here, that's a very different perspective. About half the amount are presumably reaching premature death in India, but these are not the only countries that are using coal. China has actually peaked in its coal use, is what we think now, and it may decline. India is increasing, but so is Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand and Nigeria and the Philippines, and I could go on, Pakistan as well. Coal is not done. We tend to look at the world from our perspective, but in the developing world, things are very, very, very different. Those are countries whose energy demand is going sky high very rapidly. They've begun to develop, they've begun to economically progress, but they are stalled because of the lack of electricity. So they look around for fuels that they can afford, and coal is plentiful. That's probably the worst thing behind it. It is the largest abundant fossil fuel that we have in the world. And these are countries that don't have a lot of money to spend. So The carbon tax idea is very important, and I'll tell you why. I think it's a very important idea. I don't agree that it has to be perfect. I do agree that perfect is the enemy of the good. It's the enemy of everything, really, when you think about it. But when you want to have a revolution, you need to change minds first, not pocketbooks. When I was a small child back in the Cretaceous period, okay, okay, the Paleocene period, there was no such thing as a litter law. People drove down the highway and threw their stuff out the window. That was a common sight, if you can believe that. Or if they were walking down the street, it wouldn't just be a cigarette, it could be a McDonald's carton, it could be anything. So the streets were pretty awful. The government put in place, and this was the government doing something good, put in place an anti-litter campaign for about 15 years. And year by year, it created a sense of not just guilt that you're doing that, but a sense of pride in local areas. You know, do you want your streets to look like this? Do you want your own neighborhood to look like this? You want your front yard to look like this? Or your backyard? Do you want your living room to look like this? And it was silly. It had, don't be a litter bug, you know, with a little cartoon. But it worked year after year after year after year. And it became such a powerhouse that it became a model for how you change minds. It takes time. It really does. It doesn't happen overnight. And I have lived long enough to see major changes in the country. When you reach a certain age, I won't tell you what it is yet. You know, it'll be a while before any of you get there. You know that you've lived through history and major changes during your lifetime. Some good and some, as this campaign season demonstrates beyond any doubt, not so good. So a carbon tax, I would argue in favor of it myself. Perfect? No, absolutely not. I know the progenitor of this tax pretty well. I know who he is. He's an economist, Joram Bauman. He's a friend of mine. He spent some time in China trying to decide what they should do, trying to see a society that had really made the wrong choices energy-wise. But changing minds is what needs to be done. You are all here probably in favor of doing something significant against climate change. But I challenge you to go to Dallas, or Houston, or Mobile, Alabama, or Tallahassee, Florida, or many places, let's say in oil-producing states, coal-producing states. Coal isn't just produced in a few states like West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. Illinois was a big coal state, Pennsylvania was a coal state, New York was a coal state, Indiana, Ohio, and I could go on and on. There, you'll find a very different opinion. Those are the minds that have to be changed, not yours. Your minds have changed to a very significant degree. I'm assuming that, and that's a good thing. But a tax like this that sets a precedent at a time like this is very important. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a model for other states. It can serve as an example. It can be made better, and laws and taxes can always be revised, believe it or not. They don't have to stay firm, like the federal tax on gasoline, which hasn't moved in almost 25 years. It's only 18.5 cents, and it hasn't changed. And the last one to raise it was a Republican, by the way. It was actually Bush the elder. So I would emphasize this. I would emphasize the global context, that we're looking at carbon actually being increased as a fuel base in the developing world, even as the large portions of the advanced world are moving in the opposite direction. But still, in the US, there are a lot of minds to change. And I think a tax could be one way to do that. I mean, tax, that's a four-letter word in the United States, right? You know, instituting a new tax has always been called political suicide. And in some cases it has been. but not now, not under Jay Inslee. I think it's a good time to kind of seize the mantle for this and to make Washington State, you know, something, a precedent-setting state. It's true, we are very lucky here. Our electricity is the cheapest in the country. Okay, we pay around 8 cents now, 8 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. In Hawaii, it's 30 cents. In New York, it's 22 cents. In Washington, D.C., it's 19.2 cents. We are very lucky here because we have all this hydropower. But we do have a coal plant, and we do get electricity from natural gas. But that's almost inconsequential because it doesn't have to be coal. It can be cars. That's where we get our pollution from here. 50% of our emissions come from traffic. What we really could do is build some good public transport, right? Better than buses. Nonetheless, Washington has this opportunity, and I think it's an important one. I would encourage you to at least consider it a little more, the tax, even beyond this excellent debate that you were witness to, and think about the value of that as a precedent, as an example to other states. Maybe coastal states, maybe blue states, but maybe not. Things are changing in the country at a certain level, okay? So I would ask you if you have any questions for me about energy in the United States or about energy around the world. Anybody here have any questions along those lines? Yes?
I think we all agree that something needs to be done about climate change, and a tax makes a lot of sense. But this tax, I mean, as the opposition said, does negatively impact our budget at the same time that the state legislature is under all sorts of pressure because they aren't actually funding public education, which they're constitutionally obligated to do. And again, as the opposition said, as a state that only gets 8% of its energy from carbon-based fuels, are we really going to be able to set an example that other states will seriously consider?
Well, they'll look at that and they'll use that as a way to argue against it. The point is that we are a state that gets all of it from hydro, and yet we're still voting in favor of a carbon tax. We're still serious enough to see it that way. Does it hurt? Does it hurt our state economically? Well, I'm not convinced that it will. I mean, different models have come up with different results. So my feeling is that it's something you should consider a little bit more. Just look at both sides a little bit more. I'm not telling you to, I'm not trying to promote that you vote for it because that's not my position here. But I do believe it's an opportunity. Let me ask you, what would you do then? Would you recommend that it be revised and brought back next year as a referendum?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the process that's happening right now.
Okay.
But as it is, I think even carbon law has acknowledged that it's not revenue neutral anymore. It's actually going to reduce our tax.
Yeah, and I think that economists will tell you there's no such thing as a revenue neutral tax.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. Any other, yes?
Do you think with this huge emphasis now from car companies on electric cars, with Tesla coming out with a $30,000 car, BMW having their little tiny electric car, and now the Apple car coming out in the next 3 years, do you think that all these car companies paying attention to how oil is slowly becoming something that, like in Venezuela, it's working, so it's 96% of their economy right now, they're going into turmoil. So do you think that there's going to be less incentive for these politicians to fight against these laws? Is it all of a sudden going to become less of a political suicide to say, let's tax oil and carbon because all of a sudden it's not as important? Or, you know, what do you think?
So what I think is that it will remain very, very polarized given the political climate that exists today in the U.S. It will depend less on the politicians than it will on the public and the way the public votes. Right now, Congress is, as you know, deadlocked, and I wouldn't even call it deadlocked. It's worse than that. It's not even polarized. It's people who don't speak the same language and who really do hate each other. I have students who are on the staffs of several senators. They're senators, not representatives, and they have very nasty things to say about the situation there. So politicians will continue to argue at a very high level and with a great deal of viciousness, I think, and lie quite a bit, because that's what they do in front of the public. And so that's why I would emphasize what happens to the public and how they vote. Now, electric cars are very cool. If you haven't ridden in one, take a test drive. They are really cool. But they are a niche right now. Auto companies talk about the future in terms of hybrids, and there's a reason for that. The factories that you have now for making regular cars, internal combustion engine cars, they can be very easily converted to hybrid cars, but not to electric cars. So that's sort of how things are proposed, and that electric cars will be a niche in certain cities and certain markets. But that's how it's seen today. That's not necessarily how it's going to evolve. Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I mean, I have lots of hope for electric cars, but it's not up to me. Yeah. Yes?
Isn't hydropower also contributing to climate change?
Okay, yes it is. So this is a big debate in the environmentalist community. When she says hydropower, she's really talking about large-scale dams. For example, that is really the focus of China's idea about renewables, not solar and wind. You may have read that they have built lots of wind power and lots of solar farms, and that's true, but their real focus is hydropower, and the reason is that China owns the rivers of Asia. This is the reason China will never relinquish Tibet, not because they just want more territory or they love the Tian Shan Mountains or whatever. No. The rivers of Asia come out of the Tibetan Plateau, and China needs water very badly, and it needs power, and it has plans to make large dams, very large dams, on a number of these rivers that come out of Tibet, as I said. So large-scale hydropower does increase emissions. Okay, it floods large areas, a lot of vegetation is killed, methane gas is produced by the rotting vegetation. Small-scale hydropower is something utterly different. Okay, that's very different, and that is something that environmentalists and renewablistas, if you want to use that term, also favor. So very local, small-scale hydro, it's called run-of-the-river. So you don't create dams, you actually let the water keep moving through, but it turns turbines and generates electricity on a very local basis. But there are many countries who have large hydro resources in Africa and South America, and they want big dams. So we'll have to see what happens there. Other questions? Okay, one more point, and then I'll shut up and sit down. The future of energy does not rest in the West. This is a very key point. For 200 years, we've increased our energy demand and use at a very rapid pace. That period is over with. We are not the center, meaning Europe, the US, Japan, South Korea. We're not the center. We're not going to be controlling the future of fossil fuel use. Tankers that used to leave the Persian Gulf and make a right turn for Europe and the US now make a left turn to China and India. So the future of energy use is really in the hands of the developing world, and we need to be very conscious of that. Now the last thing, I promise, was the very first time I was introduced to debate was through Saturday Night Live. I'm going back to the Cretaceous again. We had no debate team in our high school. People yelled at each other, but they didn't debate. And Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin would debate each other about the news, and you may remember, or you may not, maybe you haven't seen this, that Dan Aykroyd would always start out by saying, "Jane, you ignorant slut." And then he'd say something nasty, but then he would criticize what she had done, and then she would respond by saying, "Dan, you arrogant schmuck. And they would go back and forth that way. But that was my introduction to debate, and we used to imitate that in class in freshman year when I went to school, yeah. So I'm not a good debater that way, but you're getting a much better introduction than I got. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and excellent job, everyone.
And now I'm going to invite Dr. Michael Souders to come give closing remarks.
It'll take a second for me to get around. I'm just going to make 2 quick points. One is that, to me, this kind of event like we're having right here, the Philipsen Forum, is what universities are all about. Students engaging each other, having arguments over contemporary issues. In the university, especially a world-class university like the University of Washington, we're lucky to have experts and people who have a lot of time and effort spent studying issues that can help us clarify the debates. So the neat thing about doing these kind of debates is that they bring together students engaging in ideas with the world-class scholars and practitioners that we have at UW, like Scott Montgomery. It's kind of funny, I thought about this, the last hour has involved kind of the low point of my life at the university and the high point. There was a moment earlier, about an hour and 15 minutes ago, where I was putting out cheese on the table over there. And Gerry Philipsen, who this event is named after, is actually teaching a class right next door at this very moment in time. And Gerry came over, and I told him, I said, you know what, this is what I went to graduate school for, to put out cheese. But this is what I went to graduate school for, not the cheese, this. To have students come together and with experts and be able to engage ideas and having those experts help illuminate those ideas. People are willing to take time out of their busy schedules to come and help us learn. And this is kind of what I think that in my ideal, this is what the life of the university writ large is. This is what we do. And so some of you are in my 234 class, some of you are from other classes, and some of you may have just wandered in loosely. But when I talk about what we can do, what kind of dialogues we can create, what kind of interests can be done, what kind of ideas can come into clash, this is what it's like. This is what we could do. We could take people who do this. Because when I became a professor or faculty member, one of the things that I was really sad about is that I spent most of my time sitting alone in my office, filling out reimbursement paperwork or something like that, right? And it's only these sorts of things that are what faculty members and educators dream about, is the opportunity to talk to students, to see students come together and be active in intellectual life. That's a big deal. So that's the first point I want to make. To me, this is what university life is like. It's not all just studying in classes, or in my case, reimbursement forms, trying to get UW to pay me money back. Instead, it's people talking to each other. The second thing I want to emphasize is 2 things about debate for undergraduates. One is, as Rohan mentioned at the beginning, the 6 people you see up here, some of whom are your classmates, they don't have previous backgrounds in debate. Some of them have previous background in speaking. And it takes incredible courage to stand up in front of all of you and put themselves on the line to do this. And they spend a lot of time outside of the classes they're in. Some of them are even in my classes, to come up and decide they're going to put this together. It takes both investigations. I think you've heard most of their backgrounds. Most of them are not experts in admissions or in Washington state legislative processes or anything like that. They have to educate and teach themselves the process of how to do this. So it takes a lot of courage to do that, which is important, because it's a special thing to be able to say an idea and then have somebody come up afterward and say, you know what, you're wrong about that. And for them, it's even more challenging because they then have somebody who actually is an expert who comes up afterward to comment on what they did. That takes courage. But it also, secondly, it's also accessible. There's nothing. The students here are committed. They worked hard at this. I think you could see that. But it's also something that really anybody can participate in. Being active in ideas, educating yourself, participating in conversation isn't something that is reserved for a few people who dedicate their lives to this. How long ago did we start working on this? 3-4 weeks ago? 3-4 weeks ago? So this is 3 or 4 weeks of work, not a lifetime's worth of work. And to be engaged and to have conversations of you don't have to dedicate yourself to being some sort of argumentative expert. You just have to be willing to take on the challenge, and that's sort of what this is about. So one thing I'd like to do is tell you this is something that you can do, not by joining my program. I'm always in favor of that, but really the idea is that you don't have to join the program in order to engage in these kinds of ideas. You can take on those ideas on your own. But I also want to make sure that I give the people who participated up here an extra round of applause, a recognition of their courage for doing it.